So welcome to the 6th of our Quaker Conversation series. This is, as I've said, in partnership with Asia West Pacific Section. We will try to maintain a worshipful tone, but it is conversational. So it's not a worship sharing, but more a conversation where we're open to ask questions from our speakers. In the time of the great revealer, we are living into a new creation. So together today, let us examine what it means to live into God's creative power and to explore the theme, what does it mean to be a Quaker today, living into faith in a changing world? What is the unique gift of Quakers? We seek a new revival of our calling as friends. We seek the collective transformation of the living Christ, that God's love might be visible in this beautiful world. Let us be awake to this moment. Our theme for today is, what is mine to do? Quaker Journeys in Asia West Pacific Section. I'd like to ask Ronis Chapman, Executive Secretary for Asia West Pacific Section. She will introduce our two speakers, Gerry and Joe. Thank you, Ronis.
Thank you, Gretchen. And very nice to see everybody here today. So, what is mine to do? I've have the pleasure of introducing Gerry Yokota and Joe Vallentine to you. Gerry has been a member of Osaka monthly meeting in Japan since 1993. She grew up in a Southern Baptist church in the United States and became a Quaker as an adult. Gerry's been in a professional career teaching university English to undergraduates and cultural and literary theory to graduate students. She seeks to plant seeds of awareness of issues of social justice and climate justice through courses that focus on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Gerry's been living in Japan for the last 30 years and I think has taught at the same university for that long. I've met Gerry in person on visits to Japan and had the pleasure of attending meeting for worship in her home. Gerry brings a calm and firm sense of integrity to her Quaker work, and I'm sure this flows over into the classroom. I'm looking forward to hearing more about the way Gerry brings important world issues into the lives of her students. Joe Vallentine. Joe's been a Quaker for nearly 50 years and has been a peace and social justice advocate all this time. You will have read that Joe describes herself as mother, grandmother, teacher, activist, accidental politician, and serial offender. She's also a very good friend to many and is a great example of someone who lets their life speak. I've often heard Joe talk about the Quaker mentors that she found when she began to attend meeting for worship in Perth, in Western Australia. This is a reminder to me of how important it is to welcome people who are new to Quakers and to encourage all those who enter our meeting house or our Zoom worship space to discover and listen to the spark of the divine that is in each of us. Some of you here today may have been at the 1991 FWCC World Conference in Chevakali in Kenya. Joe was a speaker at that gathering and I had the pleasure of introducing her then also. On that occasion, we sang How Can I Keep From Singing before she spoke. You will have to imagine the singing today. I warmly welcome Gerry and Joe. Gerry and then Joe will speak to us out of the silence. What is mine to do?
Thank you, Ronis, for your kind introduction, and thank you all for joining us here today. As Ronis noted, I am not a birthright Quaker. I only attended my first Friends meeting in the United States in the early 90s when I was in my 30s, and I only attended there for 1 year before moving to Japan. And then after 1 more year of attending Osaka meeting, I joined Japan yearly meeting the following year. I've just retired from my 30-year career at Osaka University, and I now teach half-time at a private university that fortunately has a later retirement age than the national universities do. I now serve as clerk of Osaka monthly meeting and in various capacities at the yearly meeting level, as well as recently accepting a very modest role in AWPS. I should perhaps mention that Japan yearly meeting is a very small yearly meeting. Only 1% of the population of the whole country of Japan is Christian. And so we are a tiny minority within a minority, but the spirit is strong. And today I'd like to share with you just a glimpse of how that strong, strong spirit has sustained me for these past 3 decades, living and working in a country where the culture is deceptively similar in many ways, but subtly different in many other ways. In my teaching over the years, I've taught various courses at various levels, and the approach that I've found most helpful to bridge those various levels has been a cognitive linguistic framework, raising awareness about how we form our perceptions of others, especially others from different cultures. How awareness of our implicit biases can help us minimize their effect on the way we treat our fellow human beings, help us be better global citizens, and how metaphors can be used effectively in intercultural communication. My practice as a teacher is based on GCED, the Global Citizenship Education, as promoted by UNESCO. And today I'll mainly share how Japan yearly meeting sustains my endeavor to discern what is mine to do, to most respectfully and lovingly contribute to the opening of minds, including my own, to these principles. Target 4.7 of the Sustainable Development Goals, SDG 4 on education, basically reiterates the principles of global citizenship education. It especially calls on countries to ensure, and I quote, that all learners are provided with the knowledge and skills to promote sustainable development, including education for human rights, gender equality, promotion of a culture of peace and nonviolence, global citizenship, and appreciation of cultural diversity. And I'm fortunate to be working with learners at a sufficiently high level that I can use authentic materials with them rather than commercial textbooks. And so we take the SDGs themselves as our starting point. And the course culminates in a symposium designed by the students themselves, where they choose which SDGs they want to focus on. One of the most popular options they often take me up on is to design their own original SDG campaign. And as training to prepare for such a project, our long 90-minute classes always include a stretch break, okay, where everyone stands up and stretches or sometimes even dances while listening to music. This was especially important, as you can imagine, last semester when we were completely online, sitting in front of a computer for hours every day. So I try to select music to fit the SDG themes that the students have chosen to focus on for their symposium. And we talk about how art and music might be effectively incorporated into an SDG campaign. I always share the lyrics to these songs at first, providing commentary and an introductory lecture on cognitive metaphors. Later, the students also do their own metaphor spotting exercise and share the images and symbols they found in their own favorite songs. And we talk about how sharing music can be an effective aid in general intercultural communication, as well as SDG campaigns. So, how does Japan Yearly Meeting sustain me in such educational endeavors? Well, first, with their infinite patience for my idiosyncrasies. For example, I rarely offer vocal ministry in Meeting for Worship, but when I do, it's usually song. And fortunately, several members of Japan Yearly Meeting also share my love of traditional Japanese drama, the masked no drama. And that art, like many of the traditional Japanese arts, like the tea ceremony, flower arrangement, calligraphy, is based on an exquisite sensitivity to the meaning of space or silence, between words, between notes of music, between brush strokes in a painting. And that aesthetic philosophy, like the use of metaphor in communication, has a particular affinity, I feel, with the Quaker appreciation for silence, especially being comfortable with long pauses that allow time for choosing the right words. And this is especially important for intercultural communication, to be comfortable with silence when someone is struggling to translate their thoughts into another language. And so it seems to me that Japanese Quakers have an enhanced appreciation for the value of the quiet pause. And it's due to that appreciation, I believe, that they also know the great joy to be found in overcoming such language barriers, the joy of a breakthrough in communication, and the gratitude for the mutual effort to patiently bridge the gap. Actually, some of the sweetest moments I've known in my fellowship with Japanese Quakers are the moments when we shared our favorite hymns. So today I'd like to tell you just a little story about one precious lesson I learned from Japanese friends through such an experience. Many friends here today may be familiar with the old Christian hymn, "This is my Father's World." This hymn also appears in Japanese translation in the standard Christian hymn book used in Japan Yearly Meeting. And some of my dear Japanese friends have lovingly remembered to this day the joy I expressed years ago when I first discovered that they all knew one of my old favorites. I'll never forget the first time we made this discovery. First of all, we just thoroughly enjoyed the pleasure of comparing the original English lyrics with the Japanese translation. And it was fascinating to discover what is lost and found in translation, what's often found in the gaps, in the silence, between the words and the notes, where way so often opens. And one revelation I especially remember is learning that this phrase, "All nature sings and round me rings the music of the spheres." This phrase is translated into Japanese very simply as "heaven and earth exchange songs." And this translation made me realize that the original English hymn is very anthropocentric. The knowing human subject on earth is at the center. Round me rings. Heaven revolves around me. That Cartesian subject, observing natural objects. Whereas in the Japanese translation, the elements are in much more harmonious balance. Now, after that pleasant, enlightening experience, I should have learned my lesson about being so self-centered, but to my chagrin, I must honestly report that I still am constantly tempted to place myself at the center of things. For example, after that experience, I was tempted to search through all my English and Japanese hymnals for other examples, similar examples of English, my favorite English hymns that were available in Japanese translation, and to ask my Japanese friends to sing more of the hymns that were familiar to me, okay? But one day, something happened that made me realize that was not the best way to build on that sweet experience. Why? Because that would have been placing myself at the center again, asking them to accommodate my language, my culture, at the sacrifice of their own. And in selfish moments, I must confess, I may have even sometimes sulked a bit, silently, of course, when they chose to sing an original Japanese hymn that I didn't know, and I could not easily sing along with them. Which brings me to my main point about how Japan Yearly Meeting has sustained me in my quest to discern what is mine to do as a teacher, as a global citizen, and as a friend. The short answer is that they keep me humble. With their humble example, they know how and when to decenter themselves in their interpersonal relationships, while yet staying spiritually centered and firmly grounded in their faith. They remind me that my temptation to cling to my self-centered attitude, expecting always to be accommodated, forever treated as a guest rather than as a member of the family, with family duties and responsibilities, no doubt has roots in American cultural imperialism. So this is just one of the many lessons I've learned from my dear Japanese friends that I felt most moved to share with friends around the world today. It's one which I think may be applicable to many of our intercultural encounters in FWCC. That is to say, when we talk about our spiritual practice, we often speak of centering as a positive discipline. And on the spiritual level, of course, yes. But I believe we must distinguish between centering as a spiritual practice and feeling comfortable in the center of the system of white supremacy that functions as the central norm in too many places around the world, a system that's too comfortable for too many of us than perhaps we should be allowing it to be. And I've really come to strongly feel that we must be vigilant to avoid, especially equating peace with our own personal comfort. So the humble attitude of Japanese Quakers towards both nature and their place in international society has taught me so much about how being centered spiritually, but decentered in terms of my perspective on my place in the world and in my community, that this can paradoxically lead me to be better grounded in my faith. more faithful to the Quaker testimony to equality. And it's that attitude that the members of Japan Yearly Meeting model so beautifully for me. And I wish all friends around the world the joy of discovering how this model might help you discern what is yours to do. So that's my humble offering to you today.
So much to think about there. Thank you, Gerry. Amazing. I want to extend greetings to everyone wherever you are, especially those who've got up very early in difficult circumstances in lockdown. I'm feeling a bit guilty almost because it's a lovely afternoon here and we are living in Western Australia in probably the biggest health bubble in the world. We're okay, which is not to say we're smug. We know what this virus can do. But firstly, I want to acknowledge that I'm on Whadjuk Noongar land in the southwest of Western Australia, paying my respects to the First Nations people of this country who've looked after it so well for so long. We're indeed blessed by their generosity in sharing it with settlers and colonisers from other places. Thanks to FWCC for arranging this series of conversations with Quakers and others, and recognising that our Asia West Pacific section, which covers a vast area of our precious little planet, is a bit thin on the ground with numbers of Quakers. But we're here, and I'm in Down Under land, which is just the right place for me to be, and being in membership of the Religious Society of Friends is also exactly the right place for me to be. So, what is mine to do? It's a great question. Thanks, Gerry, in Japan, for the title of our talk. And yes, there are some moments in my life when I can identify that I felt a calling to do something a bit unexpected, out of the ordinary. Becoming involved with Friends in 1972 was quite a journey, having come from a conservative farming background and Catholic boarding school education, for both of which I'm very grateful. Traveling after teaching for a while really opened my eyes to look beyond my family boundaries. Seeking another religious tradition led me to the meeting house in Mount Lawley, where I still attend, and where I found a most engaging and inspiring group of elders, probably younger than I am now, but they were encouraging and questioning and active in the world seeking justice, guided by the inner light. It was all quite exciting and challenging. Two friends in particular, Nancy Wilkinson, Harold's mum, and Cyril Gare, Sally's dad, seemed to mentor me into activism and a deep search for something to replace the Catholicism of my growing up years. I loved the silence of the meetings for worship from the beginning of my contact with Quakers. So different from the hierarchical and theatrical religiosity to which I'd been accustomed, and from which I sought escape. Simultaneously, I met my life partner, Peter Fry, a great, great, great grandson of Elizabeth, famous Quaker prison reformer. And although his family wasn't connected with Quakers anymore, the prison theme kept recurring. Becoming parents was by no means a given in our partnership. In our travels, we'd seen poverty, overpopulation, and pollution in so many places. It was very sobering. So before parenthood happened, I pledged to myself that I'd work for peace and justice for the rest of my life. Strangely, the nuclear industry seemed to have me in its sights. I didn't choose it. Who would? But this powerful global network with its tentacles everywhere somehow intrigued me. And once I knew about its dangers, there was no going back. I became an anti-nuclear activist, standing with Quakers on a street corner in Perth on a monthly basis with our huge banner declaring disarmament, east and west. We were labelled unilateralists or Soviet stooges, among other unsavoury labels. 2 children later, and involvement in many activist groups such as Community Aid Abroad, which morphed into Oxfam, the Aboriginal Treaty Support Group, the Council for Civil Liberties, and the Campaign to Save Native Forests led me to being the right person in the right place at the right time for the December 1984 federal election. One of the rare moments when being a mother with 2 small children seemed the right fit for running for office. To the astonishment of nearly everyone, I was elected to the Australian Senate on a nuclear disarmament platform. I determined to take my non-violence training and my belief that there was good in everyone into the Senate. Canberra's a long way from Perth. My time in the Senate was only possible because of the generosity of my husband, who left his job working for people with disabilities to care for our 2 little girls, which was quite unusual for a man to do in those days. I was labelled the accidental senator, which I didn't mind at all, having had no ambition to end up as a politician. Being an independent in the Senate was difficult, but also a gift in some ways. I was determined not to get bogged down in the rules and regulations of the place, so I was often castigated for doing things differently. It was often extremely frustrating, but thankfully, at times, also very funny. Like the time, with a few others, we announced that we were going to hammer an eviction notice to the United States government on a door at the US Embassy. I'd been to Pine Gap, the spy base in the centre of Australia, just a couple of weeks before, and we thought, like Martin Luther, we would be there. Here I stand, I can do no other, and hammer our eviction notice on a door at the embassy. Well, of course, when we put out that press release announcing our intention, there was a flurry of activity. What on earth could they be thinking? The doors were mostly glass doors. Were we going to shatter the glass doors or what? This was long before there were huge fences around the embassy. You could drive right up to the front door in those days. I think it was 1987. And our little joke, though, was that my good friend Peter Jones, who was my research helper, came lumbering up in his funny old vehicle with a door attached to the roof. We took off our own door and we nailed our eviction notice to our own door at the embassy. Well, you could almost hear the sigh of relief from inside the embassy. And in fact, the ambassador came out and took our eviction notice from us personally. So we enjoyed doing little pranks like that quite often. I quite enjoyed upsetting the pomp and ceremony of the place without causing harm, except possibly to inflated egos. As a people's representative, I considered it my privilege and duty to open my office to the community and to build networks throughout the country of people opposed to violence, and in particular to the threat of nuclear warfare. This sometimes involved getting arrested, committing holy obedience, as I called it, and serving time in jail, much to the annoyance of my fellow senators from the major political parties. They thought it was disgraceful. This stand also involved challenging the military alliance with the United States, which is something of a sacred cow in mainstream Australia. After 8 years and 3 successful elections, my body, my soul, and my family indicated that it was time to leave. It was a relief. The third term was for 6 years, which at the time felt like a prison sentence. The getting out of the Senate was planned much more carefully than the getting in. Along the way, I'd helped to create the Greens Western Australia, a political party of which I'm immensely proud, which has had representatives in the state and federal parliaments ever since. Also along the way, I'd come in contact with Joanna Macy, a Buddhist theologian and anti-nuclear activist, whose workshops in deep ecology spoke to my condition. Joanna's Work That Reconnects is an ongoing inspiration and sits very comfortably for me with Quaker testimonies. At one of her workshops here in Western Australia, the idea for a pilgrimage to Australia, taking Chernobyl survivors to meet with Indigenous communities suffering from the nuclear industry, either from nuclear testing or uranium mining, was developed. It was an amazing journey in connectedness and in appreciation for the wisdom of Aboriginal Australians and in deep respect for those still dealing with the ghastly legacy of the Chernobyl disaster. Having heard Stephen Angel speak about the Alternatives to Violence project at the Tokyo gathering of FWCC in 1985, another idea was sparked, but it had to be put on a back burner until I got out of the Senate. So in 1994, with a couple of other local Quakers, a start was made to bring AVP to Western Australia. It's one of the best things I've done in my life. We have a very strong AVP community here, mostly focused on the core business of offering workshops in prisons, which has the potential for transformation to all those who participate. Thousands of inmates have benefited from those workshops, and it's wonderful that inmates and outmates work together in a flat structure, and sometimes inmates become outmate facilitators on their release from prison. It was also gratifying for me to share that community work with Peter Fry, who became a greatly appreciated facilitator. The climate crisis, which I first spoke about in Parliament in 1987, which was then referred to as greenhouse warming, has taken a great deal of energy too. Working with various community groups to bring awareness about the possibilities of renewable energy, as well as of the risks to intergenerational justice if we don't take strong action now, is a matter of conscience for me. So Extinction Rebellion has great attraction, especially now as I'm a grandmother. In fact, just yesterday, there was a mass closure of the main road from the city to our state parliament, where I led the Elm Dance, learned from Joanna Macy, a spiritual activity which I've taken to many places and which usually has the authorities stumped because they can't quite figure out what's going on. It's delayed many an arrest, but yesterday we got moved on rather more quickly than I'd hoped. During the COVID lockdown, I became very engaged in lobbying for demilitarization. I could see the potential for the global community to be changed by the pandemic, to be more community focused, to understand what's really important in life. It seemed self-evident to me, but obviously not to most people, and certainly not to mainstream commentators, that if we challenge continued and increasing militarization, we could solve many of the world's problems. The United Nations 17 Global Sustainable Development Goals, and here there's a direct link over with what Gerry has just said, could all be met if we weren't squandering more than $3 trillion per annum on weapons and warfare. To me, that seems a matter of basic justice, of acknowledging the needs of the world's poorest countries, which, as we know, are the ones also to suffer worse from both climate change and COVID-19. Along with that, the call for a guaranteed basic income for everyone seems to me to be an idea whose time has come. Sadly, the nuclear threat has not gone away, but there is hope with the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons before the global community. It enters into force on January the 22nd next year, sadly, without Australia participating. However, with so many nuclear weapons still on high alert, that is ready to be launched at a moment's notice, the nuclear threat is the third leg of the trifecta of crises, but not talked about nearly as much as the other two aspects, COVID-19 and the climate crisis. It seems that there is still a great deal of what is mine to do. With all of these issues swirling in my mind, the quiet relief of meeting for worship is a welcome recharger of spiritual energies. I'm so grateful to the community of Quakers for our steadfast witness towards peace and justice.
Many thanks to you, Joe, and to Gerry, and may those words just sink into our hearts as we continue to engage around the ideas you've shared.